Fragments of Us. They called it a love story, but it wasn't. Not really. It was something else, something delicate, fragile, and untamed, like the first rays of morning light piercing through a darkened sky. Love could be defined, contained, framed neatly in words. But this, it was beyond words. It was the hidden pauses between them, the quiet instances when they shared a glance, a smile, and the world seemed to hold its breath. It was a longing neither could name, yet both felt deeply. Lena and Adrian had spent a decade orbiting each other, moving through life with an unspoken understanding, a silent affection that was never quite enough to bridge the gap between what was and what could have been. They were friends, that's what they told themselves, what they told everyone else. But in every touch, every quiet exchange, there was something more, a bond that was woven with the threads of years, of shared memories, of love so quiet it almost went unnoticed. They had always been there for each other. Through the quiet joys and the silent hurts, they were the constants in each other's lives. Before the earthquake. Before the fall. And the fall always came. It started with an invitation. A wedding, but not theirs. Adrian called her on a brisk autumn afternoon, as the trees painted the world in shades of gold and amber. The phone call, like so many others, came without warning. She had known it was coming, somehow. They always called at this time, when the air turned cooler, when the scent of change filled the world. "You're coming, right?" Adrian's voice had that familiar warmth, like a favorite sweater she reached for when the world felt too cold. There was no question in his tone, only the expectation of her presence, a gentle pull that she couldn't ignore. Lena hesitated, feeling the weight of his request pressing against her heart. "I don't know if that's a good idea." His laughter came easily, like the sound of sunlight dancing on the surface of water, warm and soothing. "Don't be ridiculous. We said we wouldn't be those people. We promised." The promise. It had been made years ago, with the naive certainty that things would always remain simple. Before the world changed. Before love became complicated. Lena swallowed, the words catching in her throat. We promised. It had been easier to make that promise when they were younger, when everything felt certain. Before the ring, before the bride, before the fear of losing him had taken root in her chest. Adrian was getting married. And she was expected to smile. But how do you pretend when your heart knows the truth? She went. Of course she went. She put on the dress, pale blue, the shade too soft, too delicate, and tried to hold herself together in a world that had started to feel too big, too foreign. The champagne tasted like regret, the conversation seemed like distant echoes, but she smiled anyway. She smiled for the life she couldn't have, the love she could only hold in quiet when no one else was watching. The reception hall shimmered with gold light, laughter reverberating through the air, and yet, nothing felt real. Until it did. Until Adrian found her alone on the balcony, the world spread out before them in a quiet, breathtaking expanse. The city lay beneath them, its lights twinkling like stars caught in the palm of the night. And there, in the stillness, something shifted. You look beautiful, Adrian said softly, his voice the quietest thing in the air. It was more than just a compliment. It was an unspoken recognition of all that had been, of all that might have been. The words held a tenderness that made her heart ache. Adrian. You should have told me, he whispered, his eyes searching hers, seeking something. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe understanding. You should have told me before it was too late. Her breath caught in her throat, the words ringing in her ears like a bell tolling in the distance. She knew exactly what he meant. She had always known. But what was there left to say? In that tranquility, nothing else mattered. No words could capture the complexity of their feelings, no gestures could bridge the gap between what was and what could never be. There was only this quiet, fragile moment where everything they had lived through, every almost, every maybe, came together. She reached for him. Perhaps to hold on. Perhaps to let go. But in that small movement, the glass tipped, spilling champagne over the edge of the balcony, the liquid falling like time, slipping through her fingers. And then his fingers caught hers. Warm. Familiar. For one heartbeat, everything stopped. The world seemed to fold itself in that space between them, where no words were needed. It was enough. It was everything. And then, without a word, he let go. The release was gentle, a surrender that felt more final than anything else. No fight. No grand gesture. Just a quiet, heartbreaking release of all that they had never spoken aloud. Lena stayed for the rest of the evening, though she barely saw the speeches or heard the laughter around her. Adrian was married. He had chosen. And she would be happy for him, she had to be. Because love, real love, was in the letting go. But the pain? That was something she couldn't explain. The ache in her chest, the hollow place inside her, it would remain. She left, slipping into the night like a shadow, her footsteps silent as she walked away from everything she had ever wanted. Weeks passed. Months. And life, as it does, moved forward. But Lena never told anyone. How could she? How could she explain that she had spent a decade loving someone she could never have, that the greatest love story of her life had always been a quiet one, a one-sided one, that had never been spoken aloud? Some things are too fragile to be shared. Some things are meant to exist only in the silent gaps between people, in the glances that last a split second too long, in the touches that linger like memories. Adrian called her once, just once, after the wedding. The sound of his voice felt like a thread pulling at her heart, but the words they spoke were no longer the same. The warmth was still there, but something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. They never spoke of that night. Not once. Because to speak of it would be to admit that it had happened. And neither of them could bear that. But in the years that followed, Lena came to understand something deeply. It wasn't the love that had been the tragedy. It was the waiting. The waiting for something that could never be. The longing for a love that could never be spoken, never realized in the way she had dreamed. Perhaps the real tragedy was never the ending, but that it had to end at all. And yet, as she looked back, she saw something in the quiet moments they had shared, in the small, unspoken acts of love that had passed between them, that filled her heart in a way no grand gesture could ever do. The love had always been there, fragile and fleeting, but it had been real. She held on to that, quietly, softly, like the last whisper of a dream just before waking.